So our first panel today is titled Capital Arts. My name is Alexey Shurkov. I'm going to be the chair. I'm a PhD student at Columbia University. Our first presenter is Alisa Zhulina. Alisa Zhulina is an assistant professor of theater studies at the Department of Drama at New York University and an affiliate faculty member at the Department of Russian and Slavic Studies. She's the author of Theater of Capital, Modern Drama and Economic Life. Her articles have appeared in Modernism, Modernity, Theater Survey, Modern Drama, Performance Research, and elsewhere. Today, Alisa is going to present a paper titled Chekhov's Drama of Capital and Russia's Rise of Financialization. Lisa, the floor is yours.
All right, can you hear me? Great. So I wanted to say a big thank you to Valeria for organizing this wonderful conference and to all the participants for the stimulating and generative ideas and questions that I'm sure I'm going to be chewing on for months to come. And I realized I didn't put a photo of my book, so I hope you don't think of it gauche to show it off. This is the book that recently came out. And the talk is a very condensed version of part of chapter 3. All right. On November 24, 1884, 24-year-old Anton Chekhov entered the newly renovated Yekaterinsky Hall at the Kremlin Palace to attend the trial of Ivan Rykov and his banking company. Hired as a correspondent by the prestigious Petersburg Gazette, Chekhov covered the most notorious bank fraud in the history of 19th century Russia, the Rykov affair, or as the nation called it, the Great Russian Bank Swindle. Although the spectacular collapse of the bank took place in the small provincial town of Skopin in Ryazan Oblast, the bank's director, Ivan Rykov, and his pyramid scheme quickly became the talk of all Russia. The scope of the swindle, which involved more than 12 million rubles, and the longevity of the con, which lasted for almost 20 years, highlighted the porous boundaries between gambling, speculation, and investment, making the Rykov affair an international scandal. This is Mr. Rykov right there. Chekhov's report on the Rykov's affair had not been translated into English or studied in depth in any language, yet it deserves a closer look. This journalistic assignment not only provided young Chekhov with needed revenue, but also exposed him to the growing importance of financial speculation and his countrymen's obsession with forecasting the future. The resultant series of 16 short articles running from November 24 to December 10 detail the bank's various machinations, explain how it was possible for Rykov and his associates to continue their con for as long as they did, and comment on the theatricality of both the trial and financial speculation. Various details from Skopin's scandal and Rykov's trial will continue to echo throughout Chekhov's oeuvre, revealing his interest in exploring the theater of capital and the pitfalls of prediction. There are many examples, but one example is in the very first version of Ivanov, Lebedev tells Sasha that, quote, her generous mother will not use the occasion to pass off on her coupons that fall due 10 years from now or shares in Skopin's bank. And then Chekhov takes that out in the final version. In particular, the radical contingency and the potential latent temporality of the gambling provided an aesthetic model for Chekhov's attention to the accidental detail and his interest in the dramatic potential of what we might call the near hit. And it's a gambling term that I'll get into. It's essentially an event that comes as close to happening as possible, but fails to materialize in the last moment. In Chekhov's speculation, both its financial and contemplative sense often leads to unfortunate turn events, but not always. Sometimes speculation results in a win. Thus, Chekhov not only critiqued the modern endeavor to control the future, but shows how tempting such a desire is precisely because, on rare occasions, it pays off. Throughout his works, Chekhov experimented with different outcomes that speculation might produce, finally perfecting the representation of casino capitalism in Vishnyoy Sad, where the economy appears as a zero-sum game, where someone's win is another one's loss. I will predominantly focus on Chekhov's drama, as Vadim Schneider shows in his excellent study of Chekhov's narrative form in Russia's capitalist realism. Chekhov's stories feature characters confronting capitalism as, quote, a huge but indefinite presence, an inexplicable force, and oftentimes, quote, a monster and a primitive inhuman power, end quote. Indeed, while in his short stories, Chekhov often casts capitalist modernity in a menacing light, distinguishing between material and aesthetic/spiritual values, he tends to display a more ambivalent attitude toward capitalism in his dramatic works. And in this, he's not very different from many writers who do both the novel and drama. You see there's a bit of ambivalence when they move to the dramatic form. Theater's dependence on capital, coupled with inherent contradictions of its mode of production, encourages theater artists to explore the difficulty of disentangling the so-called vulgar economic questions from the supposedly higher pursuit of art, morality, and spirituality. In Chekhov's drama, the economy is not a separate sphere of human activity, but part and parcel of the larger world that he creates on stage. Bank failures were a common occurrence in 19th century Russia as well as the rest of Europe, as we see in Vladimir Makovsky's 1881 painting Krach Banka. The Rykov affair did not, however, begin as a swindle, and this is important, but rather became one under the economic pressures of capitalism. Skopin's bank, founded in 1857 with a modest capital of about 10,000 rubles, brought many tangible benefits to the town, including a railroad, orphanages, schools, homeless shelters, and a fire department. During his trial, Rykov repeatedly brought up the fact that he built a railroad in Skopin, stimulating economic growth and trade. According to him, fraudulent operations only began when the initial investments did not pay off because of bad luck. Skopin's case thus illustrates how an enterprise that begins with noble intentions can succumb to corruption after failing to weather economic crises. The line between an honest and a corrupt business becomes blurred in the rapidly fluctuating modern economy. Tellingly, the magazine Fragments, Askolki, ran a humorous cover that featured blindfolded Justice clipping the nails of Rykov, portrayed as a tiger with a human head behind the bars of a cage. The invention of the telegraph in 1837 and the stock price ticker in 1867 enabled the rapid transmission of financial information across great distances, making the modern economy more volatile and vulnerable to radical contingency. This new financial climate, where a small change in circumstances could potentially influence prices, made speculations, manias, and panics more rampant. It's not surprising that Karl Marx concluded that periodic cyclical crises were endemic to the capitalist system, because that's what he was seeing happening in front of him. Moreover, the exchange of commodities and information became a time-sensitive affair, as trading was now done almost in real time. This volatility and time sensitivity made it tempting to predict and profit from near hits, namely events that have a great probability of happening, but for whatever random reason do not. A near hit can appear in two different forms: as a near miss, an event that has a great potential to cause a calamity but does not result in one, and as a near win, an event that has a great potential to bring gain but does not. The temporality of the near miss is particularly important for understanding what was driving the bankers of the Rykov affair. Rykov and his associates attempted not only to predict the future, but also to influence it so that their speculations would pay off. At its core, the alchemy of banking often involves a desire to control the future. As Yanis Varoufakis explains, the banker, quote, borrows exchange value from the future and pulls it into the present. A banker thus attempts to predict and even shape the future by extending loans to those financial ventures that have, in her assessment, the highest probability of turning a profit. When a banker, quote, fails to bring about the future in which that exchange value exists, she will have disturbed the timeline. End quote. It's a very different kind of understanding of time that financialization brings about in the end of the 19th century, that you can actually influence it. When Skopin's bank was not as prosperous as its bankers had hoped, they began to engage in fraudulent operations to raise capital. Their schemes included manipulating promissory notes, selling fictitious stocks for a non-existent coal mine, and reselling lottery bonds. So a quick aside on lottery bonds. After the Crimean War, the Imperial Russian government regularly issued lottery bonds. These early financial instruments were meant to attract investors by adding the incentive of a gambling win. On specific dates, a bond would act as a freely traded lottery ticket. Their popularity underscores the close and problematic relationship between gambling and speculation, which the 19th century attempted to sever. Although public lotteries were a popular method of raising capital in early modern Europe, as legal and moral worries grew, governments sought to regulate gambling in order to distinguish between legal investment authorized by the government and various private gambling enterprises. In Russia, however, the use of lottery bonds continued well into the 19th century. The gambling term near win also plays on expectations. Gamblers who experience the mixture of hope and frustration of a near win, an almost winning hand at cards, spin of the roulette wheel, or lottery ticket continue to play because they believe they're coming closer to lucky payback. And if you want to really investigate the close relationship between gambling and investment, I encourage you all to ask an investment banker the definition of inside trading, and see how much debate happens in the room. The near hit, both in the form of a near miss and a near win, provides an aspirational temporal structures to many dramatic events in Chekhov, where a tiny arbitrary detail can suddenly change the emotional atmosphere of a scene, or where expectations are built up in such a way that we expect an event to happen, but it does not. The endings of Chekhov's one-act joke, The Anniversary, and his full-length comedy, The Cherry Orchard, have this dramatic structure. Zvonny Papierny calls this Chekhov's principle of unconsummated action, and Kathy Popkin, The Event Withheld. The near hits can be considered, I believe, a subgroup of Chekhov's uncompleted actions. What is important, not simply that near hits do not happen, but that when they almost happen, their sheer potentiality transforms the lives of the characters and comments on the aesthetic exchange between the author and the reader, spectator of Chekhov's work. So even when a gambler doesn't win, the frustration, their emotional kind of inner life has already been changed, and it's all internal. Chekhov devotes the first half of his report to the bank's machinations. Rykov's team strategically lured out-of-town customers and bribed the postmaster to intercept compromising letters so that no one could examine the affairs of the bank too closely. Monasteries became a favorite target, local papers were paid off to publish glowing reviews of Skopin's bank, and the clergy encouraged the laity to deposit their savings in the bank. The bank had over 6,000 clients, most of whom came from Russia's newly formed middle class, the clergy, government clerks, the military, and teachers. Besides the postmaster, other prominent citizens who enabled the cover-up, including a deacon who shared with Rykov all the gossip that was circulating in the town, the telegraph operator, Atlasov, the head of the police department, Korchagin, and numerous judges. Even the mayor, Vladimir Ovchinnikov, testified that he suspected that not all was well at the bank, but because he knew that the citizens of Skopin would hate him if he revealed the town's secret, he chose to remain silent. Many citizens knew about the fraudulent activities, but chose to prop up the Potemkin village. And this really reminds me, it's almost 30 years since the anniversary of the collapse of MMM scheme, the Ponzi scheme in the 90s. And when that happened, a lot of the journalists were making actually connections between that and this big scandal in the 19th century in 1884. Sort of two anniversaries that we can celebrate this spring and summer. This is not to say that Chekhov does not identify the real victims of the scam, the gullible out-of-town clients who lost all their savings, but he does not place all the blame on Rykov and his immediate associates. Instead, Chekhov offers a nuanced tableau highlighting the collective complicity of Skopin citizens and suggesting that the corruption of Skopin's bank was due to the systemic failures intrinsic to the advent of capitalism. Moreover, Chekhov shows how understanding the theatricality of the scam could help illuminate the inherent paradox of financial speculation. In trying to predict the fluctuations of an economy that is fundamentally driven by radical contingency and irrational impulses, speculation ends up disrupting it, often to disastrous effects. Chekhov presents the courtroom as a theatrical space. He compares the defense lawyers to the ancient orators and philosophers Cicero and Demosthenes, averring that the speeches of his contemporaries would continue to be translated into different languages for thousands of years. Still, Chekhov doesn't miss an ironic beat, noting that although 500 tickets were issued for the first day of Rykov's trial, only 300 seats were claimed. Equipped with binoculars, women outnumber men 5-1. Chekhov compares one of the defense lawyers, the lanky and thin Skripitsyn, to Sarah Bernard, who Chekhov had seen perform in Moscow in 1881 and whom he did not like. He makes numerous references to Nikolai Gogol's 1836 satirical play Revizor, comparing Skopin's postmaster Pirov, who claimed to have no idea why every month he would receive 50 rubles from Rykov, to Gogol's postmaster Shpekin. Yet Chekhov's attitude toward the theatricality of the trial was markedly different from that of his many contemporaries, who embraced the anti-theatrical prejudice and mistrusted institutions that in any way resembled a theater. The banking and legal systems were relatively new as institutions at the time of the trial. The state bank was founded in 1860 and the first commercial bank in 1864. And it was only in 1864 that the judicial reform of Alexander II established jury by trial, public hearings, and the profession of the advocate. Many Russians were critical, quote, of the potential similarity between the jury trial, the public square, and certain aspects of carnival, end quote. And courtroom oratory, which Chekhov praises in his articles, remained a controversial topic. By contrast, Chekhov emphasizes the potential of legal performance to expose financial corruption and its subsequent cover-up. The theatricality of speculation points to the blurry line between a real business of substance and a smoke and mirrors affair. Indeed, the theatricalization of finance is still with us today. In the lingo of startups, the term given to the manipulative technique of using the appearance of growth to make a company look prosperous and get more subscribers is called success theater. In Vishnyovy's Sad, Chekhov manages to capture both the ups and downs of luck and the very combination of rare, miraculous wins and the more common, devastating losses that characterize the capitalist economy. Throughout its production history, directors of the Cherry Orchard have often sided either with the gentry or the new, middle, and lower classes. Regardless of whose side they take, they often tend to agree on the would-be financial plot, that the state is endangered, that Yermolai Lopakhin, a wealthy merchant whose father was a serf on the state, has a sound plan to save it, and that the aristocrats are not financial savvy, pragmatic, or humble enough to go along with it. Yet, as I will argue, this state has been forfeited long before the beginning of the play. When we look closely at the financial facts of Chekhov's comedy, it becomes clear that spectators of the Cherry Orchard and its readers, just like its overly optimistic characters, have bought into a speculation. And here I just want to remark how precise Chekhov is always about money, who earns what, who owes someone this amount of money. You can really trace the plot by following the money. So in 19th century Russia, the auctioning of an estate took place when an estate could have been sold for a higher price, but the process would take much longer. Such a sale followed the demand to repay one's debt. Once the estate is sold and the creditor paid, the debtor receives the remainder of the money. So we know that Lopakhin buys the estate for 90,000 above the debt, which means either that Ranievska should receive some money from the transaction, she does not, or that the sum that she originally took out was close to the value of her estate. Put another way, Ranievska had forfeited her estate when she used it as a collateral to take out a risky loan. She was gambling with her future and being unrealistically hopeful about her prospects. She does take the money, but it's the aunt's money. She conveniently just like, oh, I'll just take that, and no one says anything. And I believe that's theft. In fact, hope is what all the characters have in common in the Cherry Orchard. Semyon Pisha keeps asking everyone for money, holding on to the hope that something will soon turn up. Maybe his daughter Dashenka's lottery ticket will win. Similarly, Ranievska and her brother Gaev are hoping for nothing less than a deus ex machina in the form of the rich aunt's money or a prosperous marriage, either Varya's marriage to Lopakhin or Anya's to some wealthy aristocrat. Such a deus ex machina in the form of a rich relative or advantageous marriage was a popular device in mortgage melodramas of the time, a time when many estates were going under. In a sense, the characters of the Cherry Orchard embrace what Lauren Berlin calls cruel optimism. They desire something that is, quote, actually an obstacle to their flourishing. However, Pishik's optimism has paid off before. When he was sure that he was done for, a railway company paid him to build across his land. Thus, even as Chekhov pokes fun at Ranievska and Gaev's optimism, he underscores its tempting nature by including characters whose wishes do come true. At first glance, there seems to be a practical and sensible solution to Ranievska's economic situation. Lopakhin proposes a plan that would involve cutting the Cherry Orchard to make space for summer cottages. However, his proposal is also a speculation, which relies on the optimistic prognosis for the future. Just like the potential for a railway increased the value of Pishik's estate and saved his family, so Ranievska's estate, which is close to the railway, could capitalize on its location. Investors would lend their family money to purchase back their estate in return for a large share in the real estate development. In fact, Chekhov's father Pavel also erroneously believed that, quote, he could sell his house for more than he owed. As Stephen Golub notes, the appearance of the railway in the Cherry Orchard is, quote, far more important than the non-arrival of the deus machina of a financial windfall, end quote. Indeed, the turn of the century was marked by the frantic construction of railways and train traffic more than doubled in Russia. By the time of the premiere of the Cherry Orchard, the Trans-Siberian Railroad was near completion, and the Moscow Art Theater itself depended on the capital of railroad financiers like Sava Morozov. Although grounded in economic reality, Lopakhin's vision for the state is speculative because its future success is uncertain. After all, it depends on finding interested investors in just 3 months before the auction date. The play opens in May, and the auction date is set to August 22nd. And Chekhov underscores the contingent nature of Lopakhin's enterprise by juxtaposing it with Dashenka's lottery ticket and Pishik's fluctuating financial luck. Moreover, before his departure, Lopakhin chooses the clumsy Yipi Khodov, who is prone to accident, as his properties manager. In this new world of capitalist modernity, nothing is certain. Lepachin's speculation is not only financial, but also includes a poetic vision of this state. This was the house where his father and his grandfather were slaves, where they weren't even allowed in the kitchen. It is also where Lepachin first experienced an instance of real human kindness through Lyubov Ranevska. The reason Lepachin can see the speculative potential of this state is precisely because the charged location has always been worth more to him than its present monetary value. While the loss of Ranevska estate is a foregone conclusion, the fate of Pishik takes a surprising turn. He comes into money. Although Dashenko doesn't win the lottery, another chance event occurs. A group of English investors discover white clay on his land. This is my favorite part in the play. What are the odds that Pishik's estate would become an object of investment not once, but twice? The recent Broadway production cut Pishik out, and I think it's a really big mistake. He's one of the most important characters. I care deeply about Pishik. This is why. Although like a gambler's consecutive win, Pishik's good luck is surprising. It is realistic because historically specific. It is not the stereotypical rich aunt, an advantageous marriage, or the red herring of a lottery ticket that saves him, but the invisible hand of English investors. Under Prime Minister Sergei Witte, the Russian Empire relied on foreign investments to raise capital. The Deus ex machina of English capital is moved to the offstage, hence the invisible hand, and rescues only one family. There is no rhyme or reason to why one family is spared and the other ruined. Pishik's miraculous financial luck shows how capitalism makes use of cruel optimism by allowing an occasional social rise or rare monetary success to serve as tantalizing models for the rest of the population. This exceptional economic prosperity of a few is not unlike the occasional big win seen in a casino. The house always wins, but it needs to give players hope, and so it allows for a minuscule number of gamblers to score. Finally, the detail of discovered white clay is significant. White clay began to be used in 19th century in the manufacturing of paper, making it brighter, smoother, and more receptive to ink. Thus, the materiality of the text of the Cherry Orchard, the newly improved paper on which the play was written and published, connects Chekhov's own creative output to the culture of financialization and question of labor. Having focused most of his attention on the financial machinations of Skopin's bank and the comportment of Rykov and his associates during the trial, Chekhov concludes his report with a discussion of labor. He mentions the hard labor that awaits the condemned. Only Rykov was sent to Siberia while his former colleagues were to toil in the provinces, and ends with a word of gratitude to the jurors for their, quote, too weak, hard, and unusual labor, end quote. Already in this early report, Chekhov displays a preoccupation with work that would characterize much of his later writing. And Chekhov reveals that the invisible hand of capital is not immaterial, but always that of labor. Even as Chekhov portrays the world of the Cherry Orchard as a kind of casino where someone's win is another one's lost, he also shows that this zero-sum economic game is only the visible drama that hides labor. After all, while the fates of all the characters remain uncertain at the end, two characters are left in a precarious situation. The former governess Charlotta, who lacks a passport, has no idea where she will go, and the former Sir Fierce is forgotten and boarded inside the house to die. In Chekhov's vision, the social world, as Pierre Bourdieu points out, merely appears to be a casino roulette that showcases, quote, the opportunity of winning a lot of money in a short space of time, and therefore of changing one's social status quasi-instantaneously, and in which the winning of the previous spin of the wheel can be staked and lost at every new spin. This imaginary universe of perfect competition or perfect quality of opportunity is an illusion because it presents a world without inertia, without accumulation, without heredity or acquired properties, end quote. Chekhov, whose grandfather was a serf, was particularly attuned to social inequality at birth. And yet, against all odds, his grandfather managed to buy his freedom 20 years before the emancipation, thanks to hard work and a bit of luck. Chekhov's unique family history and the vicissitudes of the economic world around him, including the Rykov affair, enabled him to capture the contradictions of capitalism, both the injustices and the rare but tempting chances of social mobility. And it is this infernal combination of opportunity and risk that keeps the wheel turning.
Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. I'd like to present our next speaker. It's Valeria Mutz. Valeria Mutz is the postdoctoral fellow at the Society of Fellows at the Heyman Center for the Humanities at Columbia University. Her research unites three fields of inquiry: 19th century literature, theater, and the history of science and technology. In her first book, Project Dramatic Turn, Science, Theater, and Russian Literature, she examines how theater became an optimal medium for Russian writers to respond to the challenges and promises of scientific and technological modernity. Muth's work on science and Russian theater has appeared in the, I'm probably not going to pronounce the German name, and the edited volume of New Drama in Russia. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you for my co-panelists and all of you for coming and participating in the discussion. To all the speakers, I'm very much enjoying this and looking forward to continuing the discussion today. Okay, so let me start. At the very end, let me just arrange this. At the very end of the 19th century, a peculiar event took place in the Russian Empire. In the big provincial town of Nizhny Novgorod, a construction site rose rapidly during the year of 1895. It immediately attracted public attention, and for good reason. It was a sight never before seen in the empire, a set of intricate lace-like buildings, one more ornate than the next, connected by the state-of-the-art tram line, illuminated by radiant electric lights, erupting with loud noise from industrial machinery, all the while overlooking the serene landscape of the Oka River. The buildings, too, were out of the ordinary. One looked just like a coal mine from the Donetsk region. Another was a northern hut with a giant polar bear guarding it. The next one was made out of glass that trembled with the sound of 100 industrial engines. Yet another was an ornamental pagoda right next to a building that closely resembled a decorative river pier. Even more, some of the buildings looked like they were not built by humans at all. A wondrous hyperboloid structure named Vladimir Shukov's Tower appeared to have been brought to the site by aliens. Hot air balloons were seen in the sky, as were cars in the street. The space defied imagination, seeming to have been transported from elsewhere, both eerily alien and recognizably Russian. This striking sight was neither a Potemkin village of the imperial government, nor an artistic rendering of a Russian city from an overly optimistic science fiction novel. Instead, it was the site for a monumental event that permanently marked late Imperial Russia's cultural, industrial, and scientific production. This event was the All Russia Industrial and Artistic Exhibition of 1896. The exhibition was unlike any other. It was by far the biggest and most ambitious in scale and in promise. The expo was meant to sum up the industrial and scientific achievement of Russia's 19th century and propel the country into the 20th. Goals as grandiose as these ones were bound to attract wide public attention, and the newspapers and journals across the empire eagerly awaited the opening of the exhibit. One newspaper in particular, Odessa News, recruited a Nizhny Novgorod local to report on the exhibition. A young man from a family of urban settlers, the reporter was known for a number of popular short stories and novellas. He was also something of a local celebrity for being a subject of political persecution. Such an explosive mixture, a politically persecuted writer of humble origin attending a celebration of the empire's industrial might, was certain to produce interesting results. However, no one in the Odessa News' editorial office could have anticipated that this reporter would become the most celebrated writer of 20th century Russia, Maxim Gorky. Back then, Maxim Gorky, at the time still more widely known as Alexei Peshkov, was by no means an ordinary figure. His stories, such as Makar Chudra and The Old Woman Ezergil, already had gained him significant popularity. His political leanings further bolstered the popular appeal of his works. By 1896, so the year of the exhibition, he had firmly aligned himself with the populists, faced an arrest, lived under police surveillance, and was on the brink of delving more deeply into Marxist circles. In the next couple of years, Gorky will write an anthem of the Russian Revolution, the Song of the Stormy Petal, will publish a number of successful novels that would propel him to international recognition, write plays for leading theater companies in the country, and, put simply, become a household name. Of course, 28-year-old Alyosha Peshkov could not have known any of that. And yet, recruiting him as a reporter for the exhibition was certainly a clever decision on the part of Odessa News. Having a talented writer who knew the new social order through and through report on the latest achievements of Russian society certainly made for good journalism. But the results of this decision went beyond a bunch of clever and spicy reports. The exhibition sharpened Gorky's style, forced him to confront understudied topics through underexplored media, and by way of Gorky's significance and popularity, affected the course of Russian literary and theatrical culture on a grand scale. So today I will examine Gorky's reflections on the exposition, following the writer as he identified moments of rupture in the exhibitionary formulations of Russia's industrial capitalism. Gorky, I argue, perceptively intuited that within the capitalist aesthetics of the exhibition lay the state's attempts to define and govern its publics. The young writer zeroed in on one governing strategy in particular, delineating labor relationship and limiting the participation of the worker in the new economy. As Gorky studied the remarkable vitrines and displays of the exhibition, he noted the representational exclusion of the industrial worker, the daily laborer, and the small craftsman from the exhibitionary imaginaries of Russia's new capitalist economy. The laborers were hardly mentioned, while the products of their labor assumed a central position on the vitrines. Gorky took such exclusionary politics to heart. In his reports for Odessa News, he consistently reminded the reader that the main lever of Russia's industrial capitalism was the laborer. After the exhibition wrapped up, Gorky continued developing alternative representations of workers and labor in his fiction. In his post-1896 prose, he reimagined labor power as a necessarily embodied force, offering intricate naturalistic descriptions of the harrowing effects of capitalist labor on the worker's body. Yet, from Gorky's own perspective, such naturalistic focus on the struggling body still fell short. His prose fiction concentrated solely on the adverse effects of industrial capitalism, without underscoring the subversive economic and political potential of embodied labor power. The writer, I argue, felt a need for a different aesthetic framework, a medium that could firmly connect labor to the working body without the restrictive optics of a naturalist prose narrative. And Gorky could only envision one such medium, which made physicality its fundamental principle and which could resist the overbearing pull of alienating capitalist aesthetic. It was for him theater. It is in theater, I argue, that Gorky formulated his counter-capitalist aesthetics, endowing the workers with power, valorizing them as economic agents, and eschewing representational alienation of industrial capitalism. Making good use of theater's embodied nature, its melodramatics, and its commitment to multi-sensory experiences, Gorky would come to rewrite the exhibitionary formulations of industrial capitalism in a setting so similar in function and so profoundly different in outcome. So first, let me say a couple of words what exactly the exhibitionary capitalist aesthetic was, according to Gorky. Gorky began sending his first reports to Odessa News and another provincial newspaper, Nizhny Novgorod Review, as the exposition was being constructed. In the 70 articles that he wrote for Odessa News over the span of 6 months, nothing escaped his keen eye and nothing was an unworthy subject for him. All of the notes were written in a characteristic snappy, sarcastic, and caustic style, in equal parts funny, touching, and at times distressing. Early on, the writer's plentiful critiques of the exhibition began crystallizing around one particular issue. Captivated by the social hierarchies of industrial capitalism, Gorky began noting particular exhibitionary tensions when it came to the worker. He repeatedly presented the reader with subtle but persistent rhetorical questions. that pointed towards the gap in representations of laborers, their productive activity, and the products of their labor. While the products were presented in abundance, the workforce that produced them was curiously absent in the exhibitionary aesthetics. About gold mining, Gorky wondered, who are these kind gnomes providing our fatherland with this despicable but also necessary metal? How do they do it and how are they getting by? In the Siberian pavilion, he asked, what is this done with? What are the instruments? How is this ore excavated and processed? Of Yekaterinburg's stone cutting workshop, he wrote, what is this done with? What are the instruments? Who are these artists making flowers out of stone? Who starts the engine in the machine pavilion? Who's excavating the coal in the mining pavilion? What are the conditions of workers in the textile industry? The list went on. The writer demanded to see embodied labor power. About half of the Odessa News's notes were dedicated to Gorky's searching and failing to find representations of the industrial process that would include the worker. It seemed as though in the capitalist aesthetics of late imperial Russia, examining who stood behind the metaphorical production line was virtually impossible. Through its form and its content, the exhibition meticulously excluded the workers, unraveling the image of the laborer from the results of their labor. This rejection of embodied labor and a lived-in experience of the laborer was rendered aesthetically through tightly controlled visual and textual representations. The correlation between exclusively visual representation and an aesthetic alienation, exclusion of the laborer became all the more apparent to Gorky when the exhibition departed from this singular focus on visual perception. One such exceptional example, to Gorky's mind, was the Donetsk pavilion. The pavilion was shaped as a mine and allowed the visitor to live through an actual experience of entering and going through the site of coal extraction. This setup, according to Gorky, enabled the visitors to understand the workers' experience directly and intimately. Quote, Upon entering the pavilion, you immediately grasp the peculiarities and the conditions of coal mining, unquote. For Gorky, the immediacy and urgency of the visitor's experience in the Donetsk pavilion was a result of the pavilion's immersive and multi-sensory nature. The Donetsk showcase presented the materials and delivered its message not only through text on the vitrine, but through a full sensory, visual, oral, and bodily experience. After visiting the Donetsk pavilion, Gorky seemed to conclude that in order to combat the ever-expanding gap of alienation, a worker's experience needed to be lived through and felt firsthand, rather than simply read about. Gorky, of course, was not the first to think about the depictions of workers critically. In the Russia of 1896, there was hardly a dearth of narratives about the exploitation of workers and daily laborers. Beginning with the 1850s, it was not rare to find fictional representations of struggling workers, as well as entire factory scenes, which underscored the exploitative nature of industrial labor, as Vadim Schneider has demonstrated in his excellent Russia's capitalist realism. Already in Ivan Turgenev's and Fyodor Reshetnikov's fiction, factory was presented as a site of extreme labor conditions, right? Of simultaneously monotonous and highly abnormal industrial labor. Yet such scenes still avoided the representation of embodied labor power that was so important to Gorky. Gorky's dream of recognizing the laboring body as a primary site not only of industrial subjugation, but also of economic and political power and energy was even further away, almost entirely unexplored in post-reform Russian literature. Gorky needed to go beyond mere textual depiction in order to create immersive representations of labor and to secure the right for the workers to appear as an embodied economic and political force. And appear they did in Gorky's first play, The Petty Bourgeois. So here I'm transitioning to the second part, where I will talk about Gorky's theatrical poetics of embodied labor power. The Petty Bourgeois, Mishanye, was written in 1900. 3 years after the Nizhny Novgorod exhibition wrapped up. It became the writer's most thorough attempt to offer a poetics of embodied labor. Contrary to the capitalist aesthetics of the exhibition, the play imagined the worker as the main agent of industrial capitalism, as the bearer of economic power, cultural energy, and political subjectivity. The play follows the life of the Bissemionov household, which includes Bissemionov himself, his wife Akulina, his daughter Tatiana, son Pyotr, and adopted son Neil. The Bissemionovs are the Mishanye of the title by class. They're urban settlers who make their living by physical labor. However, the family's patriarch is a Mishanin of means. So he's the head of the painting artel, a job that provides him with significant income. Besides, the Bissemionovs' Mishyanstvo is, of course, not just socioeconomic in nature. The older Bissemionovs and their children, Pyotr and Tatiana, are marked by corrosive idleness. They're idle mentally and emotionally. They're satirized for their general disinterest towards anything but their hypercritical ideals and monetary gains. Neil, the adopted son, is strikingly different. Adopted by the Bissemionovs at the age of 7, Neil pursued work since he was 17. Now, at the age of 27, Neil works as a machinist for a freight train. He's entranced with his work, and some of the play's most poetic passages come from Neil's descriptions of steelworking and train driving. Neil is the embodiment of the new working class man, enamored by labor and marked by his joyous energy and vitality. In Neil, Gorky offers embodied representations of labor power. He's the only primary character whose work is visible. Neil's appearance consistently bears signs of his labor. At various points throughout the play, he appears with a dirty face and hands covered in grease and wearing his working uniform. For example, in the second act, he wears a blue blouse. It's not here, but he wears a blue blouse, a clear indicator of his working class identity, while his face is covered in grease. When Bissemionov remarks that Neil needs to wash the grease off before entering the dining room, Neil dismisses it by saying that he can wash his face at any point, but his labor-induced hunger needs to be satiated immediately. So he says, well, my face is not too big, I can wash it quickly, but right now I'm hungry as a wolf. Neil's refusal to erase traces of his labor from his body reveals a careful reversal of the aesthetic alienation of labor that Gorky witnessed at the exhibition. Neil's demand to be fed, on the other hand, is a thinly veiled expectation of economic reciprocity from the middle-class dwellers of the Bissemionovs' household. Other characters of the play, older Bissemionovs, their son Pyotr, do not perform any work of their own. Strikingly, even Tatiana, the Bissemionov's daughter, despite being a school teacher, is not seen working once. None other than Anton Chekhov noted Tatiana's lack of visible labor in a letter to Gorky, urging Gorky to give the young woman work to do on stage. He says Tatiana is a well-rounded character, but she needs to be a teacher in actuality. She needs to return from school to toss around textbooks and notebooks. Similarly, when Konstantin Stanislavski produced The Petty Bourgeois for the Moscow Arts Theater in 1902, he gave every character some work to do. I'm not going to read the whole quote, but everyone is performing their habitual actions. Bissemionov is shouting, the mother is fussing around the house, Tatiana is grading student homework, Pyotr is calculating something in the accounting books. Significantly, Gorky, who generally agreed with Chekhov's criticisms and with Stanislavski's takes, sidestepped this one and never addressed it. While definitely making for more stageable material, Stanislavski's and Chekhov's approach concealed Neil's market labor representation. Neil's demands to be recognized as a worker in full exertion fall short if everyone else is engaged in some kind of work as well. Gorky took the poetics of embodied labor power even further. Neil's speeches in the play are sparse and purposefully so, according to Gorky. Quote, Neil barely speaks, but he must not speak anymore. Unquote. It is essential that Neil makes a bodily claim for visibility. He needs to disturb the audience not only and not primarily with his language, but with his dirty, overworked body, speaking would interfere with the gravity of this representational claim. If made only verbally, it would not be much different from the dull exhibitionary descriptions and inaccessible visuals, presenting an assault on the senses of the middle-class audience, similar to the one they must have experienced in the Donetsk pavilion. Neil is heard, witnessed, and looks back expectantly from the stage. So where prose narratives, industrial exhibitions, and even journalism fail to articulate the working experience, theater allows the worker to display his or her power verbally and performatively. In this context, it is significant that Neil is passionately infatuated with theater. He frequently visits theater, participates in amateur stagings, and in the rare moments of speaking, talks about theater at length. In these speeches, the relationships between theater and the pitfalls of industrial capitalism becomes reciprocal, self-referential. In fact, Neil's excitement about theater is explicitly connected to his interest in workers' rights by the author Semyonov, who, in an offhand remark, says that Neil will either end up a socialist or an actor. A socialist and an actor. It is, of course, hardly a coincidence that Gorky links the two. Each makes a representational claim about the worker's place within the industrial capitalist economy. Gorky's theater and politics both contest the social hierarchies of industrial capitalism. Through labor, Neil assumes an active position of power in the domestic economy of the household, countering the representations that Gorky observed at the exhibition. This reversal is most noticeable in Neil's persistent economic claims. As I mentioned, from a very early age, Neil's work was driven by paying Semyonov back for raising him, and at the time of the play's events, he had paid his debt off in full. Now Neil pays Semyonov 30 rubles per month for room and board and intends to continue doing so. In exchange, however, he demands to be recognized as an equal master, хозяин, of the household. He says, I am a master in this house too. I worked for 10 years and gave you all of my earnings. In here, right here, I invested a lot. The master is the one who labors. So Neil not only wants to become a lawful member of the domestic economic system, but believes that he has the right to control it. Given the absolutist declaration at the end of his speech, which sounds more like a socialist chant than an inadvertent slip of the tongue, it is difficult to imagine that his intent to subvert the economic hierarchies would stop with the Semyonov household. So in this way, to conclude, Neil's embodied labor on stage challenges the social hierarchies concealed within the capitalist aesthetics of the expo and counters the exhibitionary representations of disembodied labor power. In Gorky's theater, the worker is not only allowed to appear and be seen, but more radically emerges as the main locus of economic power. It is in Neil that the labor power resides, and it is through him that it operates. He becomes a manifestation of the disruptive labor force. As he resolutely enters the stage, the household, and the society, he is impossible to ignore. A socialist and an actor, he undertakes to, quote, forge life itself, unquote, Maxim Gorky's threatening prediction for decades to come. Thank you.
Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. Allow me to introduce our discussant. Kimberly Janaron is a professor in the practice of dramaturgy and dramatic criticism at David Geffen School of Drama at Yale. She's the author of Art Doing His Doubles, winner of the 2010-11 Honorable Mention for the Joe Galloway Prize for the Best Book in Drama. She edited the volume Vanguard Performance Beyond Left and Right. She also directs, dramaturgs, and translates experimental performance.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me here. And as I am not a Slavic specialist, I just would like to apologize in advance for any names that I pronounce at all. But thank you for welcoming me into this exciting discussion. And I was thinking I was very lucky to have papers that, just two papers that spoke to each other. But actually, as I heard them and thought about them while watching the images, actually more dissimilarities became apparent to me than when I first read the papers. And so I'd like to talk both about some themes that I see converging here and some differences primarily from the dramaturgical perspective, which is what I can offer. So one of the things that struck me while reading your papers was that both of you are looking at how these playwrights are reflecting the working and economic conditions of the day, forces that are so large that from our contemporary perspective, they're easier to see as a phenomenon, writ large in history, than they are to see on the individual level. And so what your readings of the dramas themselves do, these close readings of these playwrights' dramaturgy, shows us a characterization of the human effects of these large forces as minutely as possible. So the characters, perhaps particularly in Chekhov, but certainly reflected in the character choices of Gorky, these characters are shaped by forces too large for them to see how their intimate psyches are actually being affected on the ground in the moment as they're living. And it is the playwright's genius to be able to create characters affected by these changes while not necessarily, drawing the lines to the larger forces to those individual psyches too didactically. And I think your readings really help us do this thing that's quite hard to do 100 years later, which is to see how the material context, social and political and economic context, did shape the way people arranged thoughts, experiences, emotions, and desires inside themselves. So thank you so much for doing that work for us. I also had thought when I read, although I'm revising my idea a little bit more now, that both of you were looking at the dramaturgical choices the playwrights made in a way to reflect the untidy materialities of contemporary life. That in many ways the playwrights are actually changing playwriting modes so that they can capture these lives and psyches in flux. But I think I'm going to throw out here maybe more of a question, because I trust both of your knowledge of these playwrights more than my own. But I feel like the actual deep dramaturgical changes are really happening in Chekhov more than in Gorky. And I feel like there's a big difference that might be interesting to discuss between how Chekhov's dramaturgy itself embodies the fluctuating the flux of the moment. That is, as you say, like just as Chekhov didn't place all the blame on Rykov in the trial, he doesn't place blame for anything on his characters. He's far too subtle a dramatist to have villains and heroes. And as a matter of fact, that subtlety, that urge to describe rather than proscribe, especially as you talked about how in his trial coverage he showed that the whole community was complicit. It actually, to me, foreshadowed Ibsen.
It's an Ibsen's play, but like in real life.
Amazing.
That's a great point.
Amazing. Yeah, I was just like, oh, this is Ibsen. The community's complicit, right? And we like somebody to pin it on, but that person is never actually working in isolation. So that's really brilliant. And if Ibsen, comes down to us as being the playwright who shows us the most the widest variety of reactions to the fluctuations of being of the heart, of being in impossible situations. I just really like how you pulled that out of Chekhov for us. And this idea that Elisa, as you point out so beautifully, that the uncertainty of, how do we make money in this new world? How are we certain about our futures? And this, things are changing so quickly. There's a near miss, there's a near hit. How that can leave people kind of on edge, and that, again, the force is too large to actually name, right? Everybody thinks it's their own individual pathology, but you really show how those forces shape his dramaturgy so that things don't quite happen, or they almost happen, or all the guns that go off and don't hit their target. In Chekhov, I was thinking about that a lot while engaging with your work. Things that fail to materialize at the last moment, like the end of every Chekhov play. It's just, it's really wonderful the way you've folded that into the writing itself. And then Valeria, I was thinking with Gorky, that it seems to me that in many ways, and it makes sense, thinking of him as an activist, thinking of him as somebody with a clear political project, that in fact he would take a more didactic approach to his dramaturgy by valorizing a character. I mean, Niels sounds to me like a very prideful character. And in many ways, it sounds like Gorky is using his characterization of Neil to show his dirty, overworked body, his kind of defiant attitude, his desire to take over. But it seemed like it was still within a conventional theatrical structure. So the fact that the activist in Gorky was actually choosing to show a kind of, this is how we might think of the worker, just valorizing one type of character over another, is something I'd like to hear you talk a little bit about, because from what I know, he really has a thematic approach that is innovative, but not necessarily a structural one. So I'd like to hear a little bit about that. And then I guess I was also thinking a lot about your wonderful juxtaposition of the labor that he did not see in the expo versus his desire to use theater as a form of embodied labor to show it. And yet all it sounds like he could do still was to show the dirt on the body, the grease on the face, the defiant attitude of the worker who has poetic reveries about his job. But in fact, we don't see his labor. I mean, how we see signs of his labor, we don't see his labor. And I was thinking, how could we, unless the actor was also a labor, and we could, I mean, there's no way to actually really represent that. So we're still representing the representation of labor. And I think that, things like the confident command of their hands that he wanted to see, the workers' skill and artistry and craftsmanship. I'm just trying to think about how that could actually be embodied on stage, and I'm a little stuck. I'm thinking about André Antoine's experiment with the Théâtre Libre around the same time period in France, where he wanted to put the workers on stage, so he put like hanging slabs of beef, which leaked blood all over the thing for a play about the butchers, and was not repeated. But other ways that people really tried to get into the naturalist, realist, how do we depict labor on stage? And they ended up really not taking over because of those kinds of conflicts. So there's more to say. There's more for me to say, but perhaps not in this forum. So I'll end my comments here, and thank you both for these wonderful ways of linking the material circumstances that the authors were engaged in their moment with how that fed into their playwriting. Thank you.
Thank you. Would you like to respond, and then we can open the floor for the questions?
Sure. Thank you for just summarizing and teasing out those threads. And as you were speaking, Kimberly, about the individual, right, the larger forces that are acting individual. And I think, and listening to Valeria's paper, I realized that it's where Chekhov ends, Gorky begins. And I think both of them are really interested in this problem that Marx identifies. But Marx was not the only one to see a really key problem in the end of the 19th century is that all of a sudden the way that people interact, right, what Marx means by commodity fetishism is that we're no longer interacting one-on-one. Our objects of labor are meeting. We're thinking that the relationship between the objects of labor is some kind of real relationship, but it's not. It's still actually, the question is like, who made this, right? In what conditions? And we're forgetting our relationship. So maybe drama is certainly not the only medium, not the only art form, but a very visceral way to say, no, it's actually about you and me and the relationship that we have.
Right.
And with Gorky seems to be like actually really about like, no, like he's even asking like, who made this? Like, why is it? And the other quick point is the move from melodrama. And we all kind of like learned this in theater school, right? That the realists came in and they said, no more melodrama because we're going to be like innovative. But I think there's a materialist reason for the move from melodrama. I mentioned this yesterday that it's throughout the 19th century that now that we all kind of know we're living under capitalism, people start to realize that it's not just like the capitalists are not just villains. And Marx is very clear about that they can't act in any other way because otherwise they'll become wage laborers. So we have to let go of the moralism because in a way we're all complicit. Of course, I'll be to a different level, right? I mean, obviously, like someone who's homeless and impoverished is not to blame the way that, say, Rykov and his associates. But we all can participate in this game. And Ibsen, of course, shows that very well. But I think, yeah, the move away from melodrama and these innovative dramaturgical innovations that have been pointed out in theater history, I think have a really deep materialist explanation to them. Not the only explanation, but I think a very interesting explanation that we can explore.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Kimberly, for your remarks. And thank you to Alisa for your paper. Yeah, I like that formula where Chekhov ends, Gorky begins. And Gorky is, I feel like, in many ways describing commodity fetishism when he's writing these reports. Let me think. So the first point that you bring up that Chekhov is more aware of this uncertainty and he captures it better, the instability of the moment, the instability of the economic moment as well in his drama. I do believe that that's the case, but I will say that Gorky, you know, I talked about just one dimension of the play, and the play, for example, is very deeply sympathetic towards the character of Tatiana, who is, you know, in love with Neil, and she then attempts suicide. And it's interesting that Gorky still describes Tatiana's suicide attempt and an ensuing illness in economic terms. So he's also very precise about the amounts of money that everyone is earning. And so Tatiana, as a school teacher, was earning something like 25 rubles or something a month. And then that is the exact amount that they need to keep paying her doctors monthly in order for her to recover. So there is, it's always an economic consideration, but there is, you know, he imbues the play and the microcosm, the domestic microcosm that he describes with some sort of uncertainty as well. So in order to just very briefly to say a couple words about, you know, your points that I think are so rich and so to the point, and this is something that I'm thinking about, especially with the embodied labor on stage, that it is an impossible project. I think Gorky is aware of that. What I'm interested in with Gorky specifically is how he starts with, you know, prose narratives. He departs from something like the 19th century naturalist short story, or he reads the 19th century novels, and then he arrives at something like Mother Mites, which is his novel that by some scholars, or in fact many scholars, is credited as the first socialist realist novel. And we can talk about whether that's true or not, but in any case, it has this working class hero who has a distinct subjectivity that is different from the previous representations of working class heroes. And so I am interested in how Gorky arrives at Might, which is written in 1908, through theater. So he needs to go to the theater in order to develop a distinct version of working class subjectivity, of political subjectivity, of economic subjectivity. And so part of that process is turning to place in order to imagine embodied labor power, in order to combat that aesthetic alienation of the worker from their labor, in order to valorize workers as economic subjects. For example, he does that in Michanie by turning to melodrama, actually. So he inserts a lot of melodramatic elements that serve to distinguish Neil from this middle-class universe. So Neil is distinct. It imbues him with protagonicity. He's still the center of the universe, but he's not part of this middle-class domestic economic microcosm. I can talk more about this. And then finally, he starts thinking through, how do I write a worker that has a distinct political subjectivity that doesn't become part of the middle class sensitivities that the naturalist prose narratives imbue the worker with. And it is, Michanie is not the greatest play ever written, to be honest. So, and he knows this also. Yeah. He doesn't think it is his most, successful dramatic piece. But it is essential that he goes to theater to think through these questions, and then in order to write Might, which I think is a very Might Mother, the novel, which I think is a very interesting and distinct piece of fiction about the worker, the laborer. I'll stop here.
Thank you so much. All right, let's open the floor for the questions. I see. Let's maybe collect a couple. Maybe Vadim?
The twice-cited Vadim. The indispensable.
All right. Thank you both for these really fascinating papers. I have one fairly specific question for each of you, and one kind of more general question. The more specific one is that each of you say something about your particular author's choice between drama and prose. And forgive me if I'm not quite accurately representing what you said, but Alisa, you say that Chekhov's treatment of capitalism is a little bit more ambivalent in drama than in prose. And Valeria, I think you say that one of the reasons that Gorky chooses drama is to avoid the restrictive optics of naturalism. So my first question is, I could just kind of wonder if you would be willing to say a little bit more, each of you, about that distinction between drama and prose. It strikes me, thinking about this kind of immediately, that one of the advantages perhaps of drama is that in choosing that medium, each author sidesteps some of the burdens of description that come with, particularly with naturalist prose during this period, and the problems that attend to describing specifically certain kind of characteristically capitalist developments, like the factory, which is too complicated, too loud, too scary to give a kind of accurate picture of the workers within it, while also describing the thing itself on the one hand, and the difficulty of describing, say, how the stock market works on the other hand. And so the choice of drama kind of helps each author avoid some of those problems, perhaps. But the kind of broader, more general question then is whether the thing that we're calling capitalism itself takes a different form, or is something different in the dramatic works focused on it, or kind of shaped by it, versus the prose works focused on it or shaped by it. All right, thanks.
Thank you so much for that wonderful question. I think I'm going to try to combine the particular and the broad question. So absolutely. I just want to say I love the novel. It's great. I don't hate on novels. I think there's a lot of, I sometimes I come across it will be like, drama is better. It's because there's so much work that's been done on novel and capitals, like really great work and prose fiction, and just not enough on theater. And that's surprising given that at the end of the 19th century, the two most kind of the most popular modes of communication are newspaper and theater. So in the end of 19th century, theater is going to overtake sort of the novel in terms of audiences. We have millions of people going to the theater only for a brief amount of time. Like in the end of 19th century, theater really matters, right? Like it is the art form, and then it never will be that way again in theater history. And so there's a couple of things that drama can do maybe in a different way. I don't want to be like qualitative. One is to express collectivity. Put people on stage. The other is time, and you definitely see that in writers who do both, who write both novels or prose fiction and drama. What they will often say is that they can play with speed in drama. That's a little bit harder to do in the novel. So you can say, okay, this is how fast a product can be done, and also you can talk about time. And Zola tries to sort of figure that out in his novels by sort of showing you the different way that minds work. So he has to kind of do different parts of labor in different parts of chapter. It's just easier to do it on stage, like a German play by Gerhard Hauptmann, The Weavers. You don't even have a hero, it's just a collective group of workers. And Franco Moretti has this great argument in his Ibsen book that drama better than the novel represents this new stage of capitalism that is speculation, because drama can look into the future, so characters can speculate on stage. So we see that in Chekhov, right? All the characters are thinking about in thousands of years what is going to happen. So that forward movement of speculation can be portrayed in drama in an easier way, whereas the novel actually, I think, portrays better this sort of bourgeois bookkeeping, right? Like in Robinson Crusoe. So I do think it's a different stage of capitalism that is more based on the stock exchange, more based on financialization, whereas the novel, and it's not by accident, right, that the golden era of the novel coincides with industrial capitalism, which is where the minute sort of details of realism and naturalism can help make this new economic system more legible to readers. By the end of the 19th century, what is happening is that the words capital and capitalism become more widespread. So even if people don't really know what capitalism is, everyone's kind of using it, and like we do today, and we kind of know what we're talking about, right? So that happens just, people have lived longer under capitalism, 100 years had passed, right? And so I think maybe there was also like a different hunger for different representations than the novel was offering.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. I think for Gorky specifically, it is an emotional choice of drama as well, because we know that he attended a theater performance first time in his life. I think he was a teenager. I don't remember exactly how old he was, and it was the performance of the Brothers Karamazov, out of all things, and he was so shocked and so deeply affected by it. He wrote an essay about this, that he decided to not visit theater again ever, and I think he doesn't for many, many years before he begins writing plays. And so part of why I think he turns to theater in the first place is because he believes that it has immense emotional impact on its audiences. And, it's not a very new argument that no one has made before, but Gorky is drawing on his personal experience of theater going when he opts to write drama. So partially it is just this. I think also for him, especially towards the very end of the decade, the question of of how to write the worker becomes essential, because he feels like what I mean by the naturalist optics, I think to Gorky, that is specifically writing the labor from the perspective of a middle class person. So when, we see the workers in earlier fiction or in his own short stories that he writes up to this point, it is always a perspective from the outside. And so he starts thinking, I think, about how do I write the subjectivity of the industrial worker or of the laborer in such a way that they still have protagonicity, but it sort of rejects any middle class sentiments that the novel or the naturalistic short story places on the depictions of the worker. And so he starts working through this notion of protagonicity that is distinct from the universe of the middle class of the 19th century novel. And I think he works through this in Neil, because Neil is distinct. Melodramatics helps him here. And another interesting point, so this is part of the article that I'm working on right now on the Philistines. Another interesting point is that the first words of the play, strictly speaking, do not belong to the diegetic universe of the play. It is Tatiana reading from a novel. And the novel, from what we can tell, is a classic love plot that happens on the estate, something like, my impression of it has always been something like Turgenev's First Love, is, a sort of very standard story. And Tatiana is displeased with it and she rejects it. And then, and her interlocutor, another girl who's working in the house, she says, well, yeah, these novels aren't helpful anymore, but the real hero is Neil, is someone like Neil. So Neil emerges as this new hero in, as distinct from those old novelistic depictions. So that too, yeah. I'll stop here.
Yeah, can you hear me? So first of all, thank you very much for two brilliant presentations, and I think that this is a great topic and a great approach to drama as a vehicle for expression of new ideological concepts. What I'm going to do now is just like they suggest to expand the context, because it's not the first time when the drama played this function. And of course, I won't go back to the antiquity, but the pre-revolutionary theater in France and Beaumarchais' case is a clear demonstration of a very similar approach, I believe. But even more interesting is Herzen's critique of bourgeois, Mishansky, actually, because at the time bourgeois was a synonym for Mishani as a vehicle for capitalist bourgeois ideology in a series of articles published in Современник, and later on they were republished, sometimes secretly without reference to Gerzen in Russian social democratic press. But the question which I want to ask is it possible to shift from the topic of Gorky and capitalism, Gorky's critique of capitalism by means of drama, to the topic of Gorky as capitalist? Gorky's income. How much did he charge per word? How much he make? How much he invested in various enterprises? What were his economic connections with Social Democratic Party, which got its money partly from expropriations as well? How much money did he collect in the United States when he came here? So the key word actually from your presentation was an actor and a social democrat. It's almost self-referential. So he was an actor rather than an activist in a way, who collected money for his activities. There is capitalism which acknowledges its capitalist nature, and that's the case which Chekhov revealed. But in the capitalism which conceals its capitalist nature, and it's still capitalist, but selling some other products in the country. Of course, one can say, look, this is just the capitalist society, and that's why he acted the same way. But if we look at the socialist society, whatever Stalin built, the mention of Gorky in Moscow, and when you just expand the context and see the hunger, the Holodomor, the economic situation, it's got something which probably is not scholarly, but can be characterized by the word disgusting. Was Gorky speaking about himself here? Can we use Gorky's works as a means of deconstructions of Gorky's political ideological agenda? I know that I'm more provocative than I want to be, but I think this is a relevant question, and the question which must be articulated nowadays as well.
Yeah, I don't think you're provocative in this. I think that's, and I'm looking at Maya, but I think that's the thing with Gorky. What he writes is very distinct from who he is actually as a person. I think you're absolutely right. First of all, what is Gorky's social origin? He himself is very much like Lenin. He is not from the working class, right? His family is the Mishani of the play, right? It's the Bissemyonovs are his family. I believe, if I'm not mistaken. So the Bissemyonov, his occupation, he has a painting artel. I believe Gorky's family father was something similar. So it is very, self-reflexive. He is writing, but I don't know if he's aware of that, in this way. But he certainly, his plays tell a very different story. And then Gorky the play is first performed at the Moscow Art Theater, right? And who's the audience of the Moscow Art Theater? It's not the audience that would be moved by Neil's statements. It is a firmly middle-class audience that is being antagonized by Neil's statements. That is that doesn't listen to his plea. They're the Bissemyonovs. And so to what extent Gorky is aware of this? I don't know. I don't think he is.
Isn't it typical romantic epatage of bourgeoisie?
Yeah, and he sees himself as this romantic figure, right, too, yeah.
If I might just add one thing to this. So what I define as theater of capital is precisely those playwrights who are aware, and they have a lot of anxiety about that self-awareness. So they're like, I'm earning money from the theater, I'm a bourgeois. So in the 19th century, the word bourgeois really becomes a way, this is Nick Rideout's argument, an act of disidentification. So you say, I'm not the bourgeoisie, but you clearly are. Like if you're an artist, you're making your money. And so what's interesting about late 19th century theater is that these writers are not just being self-aware, because self-awareness does not absolve you from the crime, right? We see that today in today's fiction, all these contemporary novels where characters like, oh no, like I'm such a bad capitalist and I'm terrible, and then they just don't do anything about it. These players actually think like, well, what do I do? Does theater have value? Can theater rise consciousness? But I think maybe as the century was turning, we have Brecht, you have these figures who start to, again, mythologize themselves as something else. And in Gorky really sounds like, again, like we're kind of back to the romantic idea of the artist who's above that. And so maybe there's just like pockets of historical time where some artists are aware of it and they're trying to, there's a lot of like self-hatred in these plays, like some of these plays, like in the early 20th century, like Ernst Toller, they like will deconstruct and they're like, this is the end, like we should all just like die. Because what do you do once you become self-aware that you're the problem, right? So it's and that anxiety appears in all these interesting dramaturgical choices that these writers make.
Thank you.
Thank you both for superb papers. These were really wonderful to listen to. I think this follows perhaps as a combination of Kimberly's question and the one that Ilya just asked. It has to do with a claim that I see both papers making about a certain progressive or potentially reparative gesture in relationship to capitalist alienation and commodity fetishism. And I want to pair what you've been saying with Slavoj Žižek's work in The Sublime Object of Ideology, in which Žižek argues that ideology proceeds always as a kind of Kantian sublime that can be associated or analogized to the Freudian unconscious, which you never actually arrive at, but can only be presented in the form of a symptom, right? So you don't ever get to ideology. Ideology is that towards which one is only ever finding in the form of a displaced locus. So if we think in that way, then I wonder about whether it is possible to adequately, I wonder whether it's possible to resolve the dilemma of capitalist alienation, or to remedy it in the way that I see these papers doing, or if this is actually some kind of a navigation of the difficulty of ever addressing ideology at all directly, and how Chekhov and Gorky might, despite a seeming reparative gesture, actually complicate the possibility of being able to speak directly to an ideological problem.
Thank you for this great question. So I can modify what the argument of the book actually is. It's not reparation, or it's not an act or remedy. I think what the plays do, they are staging the imminent contradiction of capitalism. That's why theater is so good at staging the contradiction. They're not meant to be resolved. The contradictory position of the playwright who owns his bread or her bread or butter from theater, and theater itself being an inherently contradictory mode of production. We think about it, we go to the theater, we pay people to perform for us, and they're earning money from that. And sure, that also happens in the novel. The novel is also a material object that somebody is getting paid for. But in the theater, you can't help but see it, even if you try not to. You're sitting there, there's a cafe, people are selling things, you just put your ticket. So it's just more overtly in your face to think about these contradictions. And the other thing that I'm trying to show is that what theater does well is the imminent critique of capitalism. That is to say, to critique capitalism on its own terms, right? Capitalism, let's not forget, has a great emancipatory potential. Marx is not nostalgic about what came before. He thinks capitalism is great. We just can do better, right? So under capitalism, we were promised freedom and equality, and those ideals come from the materialistic innovations, right? There's a world in which technology can have emancipatory potential. We're just not there yet. So freedom and equality were promised. We look on the ground, that's not the reality. And that's what these plays stage so well, is exactly what your point is, these contradictions. We were promised these things, but we're living in a world where people make these difficult choices, right? They're trying, all the characters I feel very often try to do the right thing in Chekhov or in Ibsen, and it always leads to disaster. They're not bad people. They're trying to do the best thing morally and for themselves, and saving this, like Rykov, he was trying to do, like, he's not a villain. He maybe was a megalomaniac and maybe a bit of a psychopath, I don't know, but he was like, he built a railroad. That's kind of a big deal.
Yeah, I think similarly, in Mishania, or in other Gorky's plays for that matter, I don't think he claims to be able to, override capitalist alienation, because he knows he's still writing in the capitalist context. Is it possible to address, I think similarly to what Elisa has been saying, these plays in general, maybe I have a bit of an idealistic vision of theater. I think in general plays or theater is more attuned to the instabilities, to the sort of uncertainties of material and economic realities that it is representing, and it is very hard to write a monologic play, I think, especially in that moment. And so he does get to the messiness of this project in his plays, but is it possible? Probably not.
Thank you so much for wonderful, wonderful papers. I learned a lot. I have a question. Per usual, wait just one second, I'm trying to figure out how to hold this. Per usual, my question is going to be about the body. I'm wondering about the body on the stage. And the kind of repetition of the performance. And so in that regard, I have questions for both of you. They're kind of questions, partially comments. So with Chekhov, right? There is something that he is acknowledging about capitalism, that there is, like, with the speculation and so forth, that there is this accidental character, and this accidental character is terrifying and in some ways problematic, right? And it's interesting because I also noticed when I was reading Ostrov Sakhalin that one of the reasons why he's finding as you know, again, as a doctor and a positivist and a scientist, he finds precisely the accidental character of that community. He even talks about it, случайное, right? He finds it problematic. And so with theater, especially with the repetition of the body, the fact that every time somebody plays and plays differently, right, it's in some way continues to reproduce this kind of speculative aspect of capitalism in which you plan that things are going to win in the end, but you never know. Someone can like fall and break the leg or forget their lines or do something. So there is, right, to what extent the acting and repeating gets reproduced, and how is Chekhov thinking precisely about the accidental quality of repeated performance of something that needs to be repeated over and over and over again. Now with Gorky, I think actually that this repetitive aspect of the body on the stage could actually be of use to him, precisely because he doesn't want to decrease volatility, he wants to increase it. And in some way, right, what he finds problematic about the naturalist writing is that it kind of, it describes something as it is already, right? And what he wants it to be a body on the stage that will be acting, and that will, things will fail, but then that body will come again and act again. So there is already that moment in the repetition itself of somebody coming and playing again. There is already this kind of utopian romanticism that was so important to Chekhov in some way. And so I'm wondering if this is why he's turning to theater. And you can even think about Mat as also kind of following the structure of repetition, because at first is the son, and then the son fails, and then the mother comes out, right? So maybe something like that. I would think about that kind of repetitive quality. And yes, if you have something to comment.
Thank you. My question kind of follows up on the discussion of the body. I was very struck by the conversation between Chekhov and Gorky regarding what this character should be doing on the stage. So Chekhov said that the teacher should have what I'm familiar with calling business on the stage, right? That she should have business to do to show that she's a teacher. And Gorky responded that he couldn't give the characters, that kind of business, because then that would obscure the fact that the real worker is Neil. And so just the idea that business on the stage would be obscuring the status of the worker made me wonder if either of you have a sense, or maybe even our honored discussant have a sense that something changed in the theater when the theater began to represent capitalism, specifically in regard to what the characters do on stage, like business. Is there some kind of shift, whether coming from Gorky or from Chekhov or other figures at the time, where characters start doing things differently on stage to embody the new system?
One quick sentence is that, there's always like furniture breaking on stage in Chekhov. My he has this whole monologue and he's like, like he broke a stage. He's like, I'll pay for everything. He's like super drunk when he says that. Yeah. There's something about like accidents, like the body's prone to accidents under working conditions. And also like they're making like bad furniture under capitalism now, because like we're supposed to have all these great products, and yet products are breakable more often because you need to buy more things. Right. So I think like Chekhov's actually commenting on that with furniture.
And then I think about like Stanislavski like ruining lots of productions with too much business on stage. Like
yes.
People doing. Yeah.
That's what happened to the Philistines, but actually Gorky loved it because he thought that this accumulation of middle-class commodities on stage is great, because it serves him to deliver the point even more effectively that New is not a part of this microcosm. He doesn't engage with it. He's just there temporarily. But this is a very great idea, and thank you for sharing it. I'll keep thinking about this. And just to your idea, I love it. Again, I'll keep thinking about this, but I will just say, in terms of repeatability and might, thank you for suggesting this. I'll certainly, I'll dwell on this. But might, her name is Pelageia. What is her, this is my favorite line in this whole article. What is her patronymic? Nilovna. So she's literally, the might of socialist realism is the daughter of Neil. And I want to, I'm very happy about this line. Yeah, thank you both.